Good morning, and welcome to the Engineering Mechanics Institute conference. Before I begin my talk, I'd like to take a few minutes to pay tribute to a special colleague who is celebrating his 91st birthday this year, Professor Frank DiMaggio from Columbia University. Perhaps the most appropriate description of Dr. DiMaggio and his work is longevity. His work on cap plasticity has stood the test of time. His seminal paper with Dr. Ivan Sandler entitled Material Model for Granular Soils, published in the Journal of Engineering Mechanics, is celebrating its own 50 years and continues to remain a classic. Dr. DiMaggio's work was introduced to characterize the highly nonlinear behavior of geomaterials, including rock, soil, and concrete. The novelty with Dr. DiMaggio's plasticity formulation is a cap that can move under both compaction and dilation. This feature makes the model applicable not only to static loading but also to dynamic conditions, such as earthquakes or an explosion. The movement of the cap is now understood to be a result of hardening or softening induced by compaction or dilation. At that time, such advanced model would not be practical for manual calculations. But Dr. DiMaggio saw the promise of computers for his model. His contribution was ahead of the curve, as he envisioned that with more powerful computers, his constitutive model would play a greater role in solving more complicated problems across a broad spectrum of disciplines. To recognize Professor DiMaggio's wonderful achievements, we have organized a mini symposium on computational geomechanics right at this very conference, to which you are all invited. Moving now to my talk. The subject of my talk is a material that is currently at the heart of energy resource development and plays a critical role in the management of civil infrastructures. Whether it concerns geothermal energy, carbon sequestration, hydraulic fracturing, or waste storage, one is likely to encounter shale, as it accounts for approximately 75% of rocks in sedimentary basins. There are many things to talk about this material, but since this is an Engineering Mechanics Institute conference, I will focus on the poromechanics of shale. My talk will be divided into 4 parts, covering elasticity, plasticity, double porosity, and creep. I will begin with a brief background on the theory of elasticity. For a general linear elastic material, the constitutive relationship between the stress and strain is given by the generalized Hooke's law. Here, the stiffness tensor is 4th order, positive definite, and possesses major and minor symmetries. For convenience, this 4th order tensor of elastic moduli can be represented by a 6x6 matrix. The most general form of the elastic stress-strain matrix contains 21 independent components and is shown on this slide. If all 21 constants are needed, the material system is called triclinic. The word constants is written in quotes because they may actually vary with the state of the material. If there is a single plane of symmetry, the system is called monoclinic, and only 13 independent constants are needed. The elastic stress-strain matrix can then be written as shown on this slide. If there are 3 orthogonal planes of symmetry, the material system is called orthotropic, and only 9 independent constants are needed. The elastic stress-strain matrix takes the form as shown on this slide. If a material system is symmetric with respect to a rotation about an axis of symmetry, it is called transversely isotropic or cross-anisotropic, and only 5 independent constants are needed. Assuming the one direction as the axis of symmetry, the elastic stress-strain matrix can be written as shown on this slide. Finally, If a material system is rotationally invariant, it is called isotropic, and only two independent constants are needed. This is the simplest case, and usually this is what is commonly assumed in constitutive formulations. However, the assumption of isotropy is not realistic for shale, because this rock is known to be strongly anisotropic. A more realistic type of anisotropy for shale is that of transverse isotropy, due to the existence of bedding planes that resulted from the genesis of the rock. With respect to this type of anisotropy, the bedding plane represents the plane of isotropy, whereas the axis perpendicular to it is the axis of cross anisotropy. Usually, the bedding plane is the horizontal plane because of the manner in which the sediments were deposited. But we need to have a more general way of characterizing the geometric orientation of the bedding plane. To define the orientation of the bedding plane, we let L1 denote the unit vector in the direction of the axis of cross anisotropy. The plane of isotropy is then the 2-3 plane. The material symmetry group G defines all proper orthogonal rotation operators Q, possessing the properties of invariance with respect to rotation in the 2-3 plane. The second-order microstructure tensor phi thus defines the geometric configuration of the bedding plane. For a transversely isotropic material, we can also construct an elastic compliance matrix, which is the inverse of the elastic stress-strain matrix. Here, the compliance matrix is expressed in terms of more meaningful elastic parameters such as the elastic modulus E1 in the direction perpendicular to the bedding plane, E2 on the plane of isotropy, 2 Poisson's ratios, and 1 shear modulus. The second shear modulus that appears on this slide is not an independent constant, but can be determined from the other 5 elastic constants. In the isotropic case, we know that the Poisson's ratio is required to have a value within the interval -1 and 0.5 for the material to be stable. However, for a transversely isotropic material, the Poisson's ratios have no bounds. That is to say, they can be less than -1 or greater than 0.5. We know that the stiffness moduli of geomaterials depend on the confining stress. But shales contain a significant amount of clay, so their elastic properties also depend on the state of saturation of the rock. Because the orientation of clay particles in a shale is partly responsible for its anisotropic behavior, the presence of water affects the properties of the rock differently in the bed normal and bed parallel directions, denoted as Bn and Bp respectively. Therefore, we can expect that the degree of anisotropy, which is the ratio between 2 elastic moduli, is not fixed, but evolves with degree of saturation. This is corroborated by lab tests on different types of shale. Romero et al. Showed 2 types of porosity in boom clay: macroporosity or interaggregate pores, with characteristic pore size on the order of 7 to 10 microns, and microporosity or intra-aggregate pores, with pore size on the order of tens of nanometers. The left image on this slide shows an S-compacted boom clay obtained from environmental scanning electron microscopy, or ESEM. The dark regions are the interaggregate pores. The middle image shows that hydrating the clay leads to the closing of the macropores and increasing the micropore space. Note in the middle image that the very dark regions representing the interaggregate pores have nearly disappeared as the micropores swelled. On the other hand, the image on the right shows that drying leads to shrinking of the samples and disaggregation of clay particles. This slide shows microcity images of the same area of an opalinous shale sample. At dry state on the left and at wet state on the right. These images, taken from Yurikov et al., are 2D slices of a 3D volume, cut perpendicular to the bedding plane. The direction of bedding is shown with red arrows. Pink arrows indicate the distance between pairs of the most prominent features on the scans, such as dense grains of quartz or calcite. We can see that the size of the sample in the direction perpendicular to the bedding plane has increased due to swelling from 532 to 541 microns. On the other hand, there was no significant change of size along the bedding plane, from 505 microns to about the same number. In this case, hydration of the sample only caused swelling in the direction normal to bedding, but had little effect in the direction parallel to bedding. Yurikov et al. Measured P and S wave velocities in both bed parallel and bed normal directions of opalinous clay shale, and observed both wave velocities to increase with dehydration. This slide shows the measurements from Yurikov et al. On these samples at different hydration states. Here, E1 is the modulus perpendicular to bedding, whereas E2 is the modulus parallel to bedding. We see that the variations of the stiffness moduli with degree of saturation are nearly linear, with E2 changing more significantly than the other stiffness moduli. The variations of the two Poisson's ratios, however, are not linear. In fact, the Poisson's ratio nu-2,3 increased slightly with degree of saturation, and then changed in sign to a significantly negative value at the nearly saturated state. Since we are more interested in capturing trends rather than matching the actual variations of the elastic parameters, we also performed linear regressions on the Poisson's ratios and represented their variations with straight lines. In general, straight line variations of an elastic parameter, say x, require two parameters of the straight line. Here, we use the value at the saturated state xsat, and the slope a representing the rate of change of the elastic parameter with respect to saturation. In this equation, x could be any of the stiffness moduli or Poisson's ratios. This straight line variation can easily be established by linear regression of lab data. From these straight line variations, we can quantify the anisotropy ratio, XR, as a rational function of saturation emanating from the ratio of two linear functions. The corresponding anisotropy ratios for Young's moduli and Poisson's ratios show a monotonic decrease with increasing saturation, while the variation of the shear moduli ratio with saturation is not monotonic. The estimated anisotropy ratio for Young's moduli, represented by the red dashed curve, matches well with the measured data points from Yurikov et al. The estimated shear moduli ratio, represented by the black dashed curve, slightly overestimates the ratio at the nearly saturated state and underestimates the ratio at the nearly dry state. The estimated Poisson's ratio anisotropy, represented by the blue dashed curve, is not quite good due to the poor fit of the linear function on one of the Poisson's ratios. An upshot of an evolving anisotropy ratio in the stiffness moduli is an evolving anisotropy ratio in the normal strains during a shrinkage test. We conducted numerical simulations of opalinous shale dehydrating between a range of saturation from 50% down to 10% saturation, and compared our simulation results with the lab measurements of Yurikov et al. Two cases of mechanical properties were simulated and compared. The case with variable stiffness anisotropy uses elastic parameters consistent with those obtained from linear regressions, while the case with constant stiffness anisotropy uses constant elastic parameters reported by Yurikov et al. For opalinous shale at 44% saturation. The figure on the right of this slide compares the evolution of anisotropic normal strains during the drying process. The case with a constant stiffness anisotropy results in nearly zero strains in the bed parallel direction. However, the normal strain in the bed normal direction decreased between 170 megapascal to 400 megapascal suction, implying an increase in the specimen volume during the drying process, an exotic behavior which is unrealistic. In contrast, the predicted strains for the case with variable stiffness anisotropy appear to be more realistic. In closing, we note that suction stress impacts the elastic properties of shale. Ignoring this factor could lead to unrealistic predictions of its mechanical response, particularly when the shale experiences saturation or desaturation. The second part of my presentation revolves around plastic deformation and strength of transversely isotropic rocks. To motivate this presentation, it is important to note that shale generally contains clay minerals and organics. So we can expect either brittle or ductile inelastic deformation depending upon the clay and organic content. Inelastic deformation could be due to compaction of the micropores and macropores, fracture and/or damage including particle breakage, detachment and sliding on bedding planes, and shear band or strain localization. The degree of inelastic deformation in a rock depends on the load level. This image shows a low-load nanoindentation in a sample of Barnett shale. The nanoindenter was placed on top of a relatively large particle of dolomite. The SEM image on the right shows the residual impressions on this mineral. Because the prescribed indenter load was very small, and because the material is hard, the indent is hardly noticeable. In contrast, this slide shows impressions of a Berkovich indenter on the surface of a specimen of Barnett shale when the indenter load has reached a few newtons. The figure on the left suggests that both macropores and micropores have been compressed by the force of the indenter. The figures in the middle and on the right show some damage in the form of fractures of clay particles and separation of the grains. The force displacement curves from indentation tests are depicted on this slide. A typical loading protocol consists of applying the indenter load up to a maximum value, holding the load fixed for several minutes and gradually removing the load. With a hard shale, the load and load curves are nearly the same. However, when the indenter is placed on the much softer kerogen, the load and load curve suggests significant plastic deformation. Note that the kerogen exhibited significant creep as well, which is the additional indentation that developed at a fixed indenter load. The test results on the left pertain to indentation on the order of nanometers and were aimed at investigating the properties of the minerals and organics. In contrast, the figure on the right shows indentation on the order of several microns, aimed at investigating the properties of the rock matrix. Synthetic rocks are rock-like materials made of different constituents that are mixed together to produce a new material whose properties are similar to those of natural rocks. Tien et al. Vary the weight ratios of cement, kaolinite, and water to produce the synthetic transversely isotropic rock specimens shown on this slide. Inelastic deformations observed on cylindrical specimens of synthetic rocks were due primarily to sliding along as well as across the discontinuities. In addition, the strength of the specimens depended on the orientation of bedding planes relative to the load. A distinctive characteristic of transversely isotropic materials is their strength anisotropy. In general, their strength in the direction normal to bedding is not the same as their strength parallel to bedding. But more noteworthy is the lower strength exhibited by this material when the load is applied at an angle relative to bedding. Plots of measured strength as a function of bedding orientation are shown on this slide for 4 different types of shale. The plots resemble asymmetric U-shaped curves with shoulders that have been a gold test for the assessment of the robustness of a constitutive model. In fact, many plasticity models developed for shale fail to reproduce this U-shaped variation of strength with bedding orientation. A plasticity model that captures this asymmetric U-shaped variation of strength with bedding orientation is an anisotropic modified camp clay model proposed by the Stanford group. The yield surface is an ellipsoid of modified camp clay, but is rotated according to the microstructure tensor. To facilitate the introduction of anisotropy, the stress field sigma is first rotated to a fictitious configuration sigma star, according to the projection tensor P, as shown in this equation. The projection tensor is a function of microstructure tensor phi, as well as the anisotropy parameters C1, C2, and C3. If the coordinate axes are aligned with the bedding plane, then the projection tensor becomes a diagonal matrix with anisotropy parameters alpha, beta, and gamma. The parameters can be normalized by setting gamma equals 1. This slide explains the reason behind the use of a fictitious stress space. For values of anisotropy parameters alpha and beta other than 1, the yield surface is a rotated ellipsoid with a mathematically complicated form. But in the fictitious stress space, the form is identical to the isotropic modified camp clay with the p-axis as the axis of revolution. By working with the fictitious stresses, we simplify the form of the yield criterion. We use the aforementioned constitutive framework to simulate the strength anisotropy of a triaxial sample of normally consolidated Tournimar shale. Experimental data for the tests have been provided by Niandu et al., as shown on this slide. Observe a higher strength in the bed parallel direction than in the bed normal direction. The model approximately captures the U-shaped variation of strength, including the fact that the left shoulder at theta equals 0 is lower than the right shoulder at theta equals 90 degrees. The lower strength in the bed normal direction could be due to bending mechanism on the clay particles that reduces the strength and stiffness of the rock in the bed normal direction. This slide shows a similar simulation of the strength anisotropy of the synthetic transversely isotropic rocks tested by Tien et al. Like the previous slide, the samples exhibited a higher strength in the bed parallel direction than in the bed normal direction. Lab data also show a strength increase with confining pressure. The dashed curves are the simulation results. This hypothetical simulation on Tournimar shale depicts the onset of strain localization in the form of a shear band under plane strain condition. The plot on the right shows the vertical axis psi defining the normal to the shear band as a function of the bedding orientation theta, which is the horizontal axis. We see that psi varies from 42 degrees to around 51 degrees. But the upshot of this analysis is that a shear band would form across the bedding plane, where the rock is weaker, and not along the bedding plane, where the rock is stronger. To close this section, we conclude that anisotropy impacts not only the elastic properties, but also the plastic responses of a shale, including its propensity to undergo strain localization. The materials presented in this part of my presentation were derived from these two papers, both of which were published just last month. The first paper in Acta Geotechnica focuses on poroelasticity in an isotropic single and double porosity media. The second paper in Computer Methods in Applied Mechanics and Engineering goes into the subject of elastoplasticity, also in the context of double porosity. In this third part of my presentation, I will highlight the multi-porosity of shale and the vast range of its pore sizes. Multiple porosity models compartmentalize the various storage and flow mechanisms into separate groups in double, triple, and even quadruple porosity models. Our work is limited to a double porosity description encompassing the deformation and flow mechanisms. Being a nanoporous material, shale permits fluid to flow through its nanopores as well as through distributed microcracks, resulting in preferential flow pattern and associated deformation mechanisms. The double porosity framework is an idealized smeared theory, as shown on this slide. The micropores are the intra-aggregate pores, or the matrix pores, whereas the macropores are the inter-aggregate pores, or the fracture pores. Fluid could flow through the micropores and through the macropores, as well as be exchanged through the interfaces between the two pore scale domains. The mechanisms considered in this study are as follows. Fluid could flow through the micropores. In shale, these pore spaces are on the order of nanometers. Fluid could also flow through the macropores, or the voids created by the fractures. Unless the fractures are randomly oriented, the overall flow through the fractures is typically anisotropic. Finally, fluid could be exchanged between the macropores and micropores. Because the flow through the macropores is typically much faster than the flow through the micropores, the fluid in the micropores should drain into the macropores, and not the other way around. New contributions of this presentation include a mechanistic framework for incorporating anisotropy in the elastic and elastoplastic responses, anisotropy in the fluid flow response, the introduction of a BO tensor for the case where the compressibility of the solid grains is comparable to the compressibility of the solid skeleton, and a distinction between the BO and Terzaghi effective stresses in the elastoplastic range. In poroelasticity, the effective stress equation in a double porosity medium is shown in this slide, where sigma is the total Cauchy stress tensor. Sigma prime is the effective stress. P bar is the mean pore pressure, calculated from the pore pressures in the macropores and micropores, and weighted according to the pore fraction psi in the micropores. And B is the BO tensor. From here on, we shall call sigma prime as the BO effective stress. Zhang and Borja employed the superposition principle, whereas Zhao and Borja made use of thermodynamics of a continuum and arrived at the same expression for the BO tensor, B. In this expression for B, CE is the drained tensor of elastic moduli for the solid matrix, whereas Ks is the bulk modulus of the solid grains. This expression is true for triclinic, monoclinic, orthotropic, transversely isotropic, and isotropic systems. For isotropic systems, the BO tensor reduces to the form derived by Borja and Kuliji. where K bar is the drained bulk modulus of the solid skeleton and alpha is the well-known BO coefficient. On the other hand, there are two effective stress equations in poroelastoplasticity. The first equation uses the BO effective stress sigma prime, in which the mean pore pressure is scaled by the BO tensor B. The second equation uses the Terzaghi effective stress sigma double prime, where the mean pore pressure is scaled by the Kronecker delta tensor. The origin of these two effective stress equations is the first law of thermodynamics for a double porosity system, which states that the rate of change of internal energy consists of the mechanical power of the BO stress tensor in elastically deforming the solid matrix, plus the mechanical power of the Terzaghi stress tensor in plastically deforming the same solid matrix, among others. In this equation, D is the rate of deformation tensor. The Clausius-Duhem inequality, along with the Coleman relations, then result in the generalized Hooke's law in terms of sigma prime and the dissipation inequality in terms of sigma double prime. This development suggests that the plasticity framework must be formulated in terms of sigma double prime. The novelty in the recently proposed plasticity framework is the use of the Terzaghi effective stress in the plasticity formulation while satisfying the generalized Hooke's law based on the BO effective stress. Indeed, this is possible by assuming the Terzaghi effective stress to be driven by an alternative strain epsilon tilde, whose elastic component is a linear combination of the true elastic strain and the mean pore pressure P bar. In the limit of incompressible solid grains, the two elastic strains become identical, and there is no difference between the BO and Terzaghi effective stresses. With the alternative strain, classical formulations and algorithms in elastoplasticity may be employed with very little modification. The coupled theory can be enhanced further by assuming the permeability tensor for the macropores to be transversely isotropic with two possibly distinct permeabilities in the bed normal and bed parallel directions. As for the micropores, we assume the permeability tensor to be isotropic. Ferrari et al. Conducted one-dimensional consolidation tests on opalhinous clay shale cored perpendicular to the bedding plane. The specimens used in the experiments were drained on both the top and bottom surfaces. Each load increment was applied in two stages, with each stage applied at a constant rate, as shown in this slide. 60% of the load increment was applied over a period of 60 seconds. The rest over the next 160 seconds. The figure on the right shows the settlement time history for one of the many stages of loading, with a simulated response matching the experimental data points quite well. Note that the settlement time response does not flatten out, but instead continues beyond the primary compression curve. This curve shows the calculated mean pore pressure at the center of the shale specimen. Pore pressure dissipation consists of two S-shaped curves. The first S-shaped curve covers the primary consolidation phase, where the fluid in the macropores drain into the top and bottom boundaries. The second S-shaped curve covers the secondary consolidation phase, where the fluid in the micropores drain into the macropores. We see that double porosity theory results in a separation of two temporal scales. The next set of simulations illustrates simultaneous fluid flow through the macropores and micropores in 2 dimensions. The problem consists of the classic plane strain consolidation of an elastoplastic porous medium subjected to a strip load. This time, the foundation is made up of a double porosity material with the properties of Tournemire shale and with bedding plane at 45 degrees. Equal order bilinear quads in displacements and pressures were used with and without stabilization. Let's take a look at the fluid flow through the macropores. The movie shows that the inclined bedding plane results in a highly asymmetric and even somewhat chaotic fluid flow through the macropores. Now, let's take a look at the fluid flow through the micropores. Even though the micropore permeability was assumed to be isotropic, the anisotropy in the macropore permeability causes the flow in the micropores to be asymmetric as well, although there is more symmetry than the flow through the macropores. This pair of movies is the same as in the previous slide, except the background shows the dissipation of excess pore pressures in the two pore scales. Observe that the excess pore pressures in the macropores on the left-hand side dissipate faster. Finally, this pair of images shows close-up views of the micropore excess pore pressures at the beginning of consolidation. Both images demonstrate the classic pore pressure oscillation attributed to in-soup instability. But with the stabilization proposed by Cho and Borja, the unwanted pore pressure oscillation disappears. And stabilized. Moving now to the fourth and final part of my presentation, which is creep in shale. There are two relevant references that I'd like to bring to your attention. The first one is entitled Mechanisms of Creep in Shale from Nanoscale to Specimen Scale, and will appear in a special issue of Computers and Geotechniques in memory of the late Professor Gyan Pandey. The second paper was published last year in Computer Methods in Applied Mechanics and Engineering, and is the 9th installment of the CAMCLAY series. It focuses on anisotropy, heterogeneity, and viscoplasticity of shale. Creep is the time-dependent deformation that takes place in a material under the condition of sustained load across space and time. Because we recognize that creep takes place at different scales in space and time. By across space, we recognize that creep takes place not only at the nanometer scale, but all the way up to the millimeter scale and beyond. My talk will only cover the scale from nanometers to millimeters, but even then, we realize that this range of spatial dimensions is already 6 orders of magnitude in the metric scale. Our effort has been inspired by our ability to experimentally probe creep deformation of a shale sample at the nanometer scale through nanoindentation testing, and the creep response at the millimeter scale through triaxial testing. By across time, we know that nanoindentation creep typically lasts no more than 10 minutes. We recall the standard loading protocol for indentation testing. First, the indenter is pushed into the surface of a sample. Then, the load is held fixed for several minutes before it is gradually removed. It is during this hold stage, under a condition of sustained load, where creep of the shale is observed. However, the hold period for indentation creep tests is limited to around 10 minutes, mainly because of the measurements that could be impacted by thermal drift, as well as by frame compliance, resulting in unreliable test data. But even then, depending on the material being indented, Kerogen, for example, Significant creep could be observed during the period of sustained load. In contrast, triaxial creep tests have a duration of several hours, sometimes even much longer, like days or weeks. The question is, how do we reconcile these measurements that span several orders of magnitude across space and time? Our approach is to bridge the nanoscale creep and the millimeter scale creep through a two-material constitutive framework called CAM-CLE-9. CAM-CLE-9 is a mesoscale model, herein understood to be the micrometer scale. Since nanometers and millimeters are 6 orders of magnitude apart on the metric scale, we need a model that lies in between these two endpoints. Otherwise, the jump from nano to milli would be too drastic. CAM-CLE-9 implicitly recognizes the heterogeneity of shale at the nanoscale and explicitly at the micrometer scale. Even at the nanometer scale, shale is known to be extremely heterogeneous. The left side of this slide shows an SEM image of Woodford shale revealing different mineral components, including pyrite, silicates, as well as organic materials. Explicitly representing all these minerals and organics into the modeling of a shale would be a hopeless effort. That is why Sonny and Sobak suggested to group these elements into hard and soft material groups, where the hard material group includes quartz, feldspar, pyrite, and carbonates, whereas the soft material group includes clays and kerogen. The figure on the right shows a ternary plot representing the composition of different shales, from which the percentages of the hard and soft material groups can be inferred. We use the same idea in the CAM-CLE-9 model, where shale is assumed to be composed of overlapping hard and soft materials. Thus, the stress tensor can be partitioned between the hard and soft material groups. Furthermore, if the distribution of the two groups is nearly 50-50 by volume, then the strains in the hard and soft material frames may be assumed to be the same. One can verify if the assumption of a continuous material frame is realistic for both the hard and soft material groups by imaging a small volume of shale. On this slide, we show 3D reconstruction of shale volume from serial sectioning and imaging. The figure on the left shows a 3D solid rendered from 500 backscattered electron images. By setting thresholds on the grayscale of this 3D solid, the kerogen and pore distributions can also be constructed. Note that even though kerogen comprised only 7.52% by volume, the frame is already nearly continuous. The image in the middle only shows the kerogen frame. If the clay material is added to kerogen, then the soft material frame would look even more continuous. The constitutive framework in CAM-CLE-9 is based on rate-dependent viscoplasticity. The schematics of the model are shown on this slide. The elastic region is defined by the space where F is less than 0. The yield surface is where F equals 0. In classical rate-independent elastoplasticity, the region where F is greater than 0 is forbidden, but not in viscoplasticity. The viscoplastic strain rate tensor is shown on this slide, where F is greater than 0. There are two classes of viscoplastic formulations. The first is by Duval and Lyons, where the direction of the viscoplastic strain rate is determined by the distance between the stress point sigma and its closest point projection on the yield surface denoted by sigma with an open circle. The denominator tau is called relaxation time. This formulation views creep from the point of view of stress relaxation. The second is a formulation by Perzina, which states that the rate of viscoplastic strain depends on how large is the value of the yield function f. Here, the two angles are the Macaulay brackets, and the quantity eta in the denominator is the viscosity coefficient. It turns out that there is not much difference between the two viscoplastic formulations, as demonstrated in the simulation of triaxial creep of Barnett shale, in which the bedding plane is oriented in the vertical direction. Here, BP is bed parallel, whereas BN is bed normal. The slide shows the experimental results by Sony and Zobak. Here are the simulation results based on the Duval-Lyons formulation, and the simulation results based on the Perzina simulation. Observe that the simulations make a distinction between bed normal and bed parallel lateral strains, whereas the experimental data did not differentiate between the two. We see that the two viscoplastic formulations yield nearly identical results. Indentation is a contact problem, so simulating this problem requires a robust contact algorithm. There is, however, a special feature of the present contact problem in that the indenter is made of diamond, which is many times harder than the shale that is being indented. Thus, the indenter can be assumed to be a rigid body. We use the Lagrange multipliers method for the contact problem, in which the indenter is represented by a 1 degree of freedom system. We should also emphasize that creep occurs at a sustained load, so a Neumann boundary condition must be imposed on the indenter, not a Dirichlet boundary condition. Here's the result of a 3D simulation of indentation with a Berkovich indenter. The shape of the indenter is shown on the right. And here is the impression of the indenter on a sample of Woodford shale, imaged by Bennett et al. This movie is produced from a 2D simulation of creep on Woodford shale, with bedding oriented at 45 degrees. The first part of the simulation is where the load is increased. Then the load is held fixed, and the shale is allowed to creep. Note that the blue velocity vectors going to the left in the direction of the bedding plane are more dominant than the red velocity vectors going to the right across the bedding plane, demonstrating the effect of anisotropy. This final example shows that creep deformation can also result in the formation of shear bands. The simulation is 2D plane strain with a stochastic distribution volume fractions for the hard and soft material groups. The figure on the left shows the finite element mesh with a color bar representing the volume fraction of the soft material frame. The figure on the right shows the bedding plane at 45 degrees. Let's take a look at the ensuing shear bands resulting from creep. The video shows an interesting pattern in which shear bands are generally oriented in the weaker bed normal direction, but smaller shear bands are arranged in phalanx formation, aligned with the bedding plane. Note that if there was no anisotropy, the shear bands would be randomly positioned and randomly oriented, but not in this example, where the material is transversely isotropic. To my knowledge, this is the first time that shear bands are shown to be numerically reproduced under the condition of a constant load. Finally, I would like to close this presentation by saying that work is continuing on these topics in my research group at Stanford. Currently, I have 6 doctoral students working on different aspects of this subject, 2 of whom are scheduled to graduate this year. We had planned to conduct experiments, including high-resolution imaging and indentation testing, in collaboration with Los Alamos National Laboratory, but they were halted by the pandemic. We are very optimistic, of course, that these experiments will resume once we all get fully vaccinated. I would like to acknowledge my collaborators, all of whom are either former or current students. Also, Professor Abu Slyman for providing samples of Woodford shale. And thanks are due to our sponsors, the Department of Energy, National Science Foundation, and the SLAC, National Accelerator Laboratory. Thank you.